Hey folks, welcome to week 11 of DMD 105, Digital Design Foundations. How's everybody doing? All right, so I know you're working hard in Illustrator and plugging right along. Let's take a look at our week 11 module. Okay, so if we jump down here to the bottom to things that are due this week, sometime before this week is over, you have all week to work on it. Hop on over to quiz number 4, which is all about typographic anatomy. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about a whole bunch of different concepts with regard to typography as an area of study, the history of typography, and the typography tools in Illustrator. But one of the specific handouts was all about typographic anatomy, and so this quiz focuses on that, where hopefully you've taken some time to review that handout, learned the vocabulary and the structure of various letter forms, and now you can go take the quiz. So before the week is over, go take the quiz. It is completely in Canvas. Unlike our other quizzes, which were a list of things you had to do in a particular piece of software given a certain amount of time, this is a more traditional quiz with multiple choice, fill in the blank, that sort of thing. And it all happens right inside Canvas. So simply click on this link here and you can go begin the quiz and get it done whenever you would like. Sometime this week, get that thing done. All right, next this week, of course, at the very end of the week, Project 3 is due. You're going to turn that into Canvas at the very end of the week, which is your typographic poster design, which is a typographic design based on a given word. You got to choose one of the words from a list, and it's meant to be done in the design style of famous graphic designer Herb Lubalin that we talked about last week. So get working on that. Now, a little later in the week, we're going to introduce our next project, Project 4, which is our Vector Celebrity Portrait, which will be our last project in Adobe Illustrator, but we'll talk about that a little later in the week. Okay, meanwhile, new information for this week is that we're going to talk about the concept of preparing your files for the web. Because so far we've created a variety of items in both Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. But in the real world, both Photoshop files, which the file extension is .psd, and of course Illustrator files, the file extension is .ai, those are working files. Those are the types of files you need to work in Photoshop and Illustrator. But when you're all done with the item you are designing, you don't turn it in to your client or to the printer or to the publisher or to the web developer or wherever it needs to go in its original format. You don't turn in PSD or AI files. You instead have to convert those files to something that can be produced, that can be published. Now, we're not so much talking about preparing it for print. We don't really do that in this class, but I do cover some of that in one of the handouts that we have here. So it's good to know that information. But we're really more interested in preparing files for the web, because the next piece of software we're going to get into is Adobe XD, which is a layout program for web design. So if you wanted to include any of the projects that you created in Photoshop or Illustrator in a website, for example, or in an app, you would have to first optimize those images so that they could be published in such a format. So let's learn about that. So there is a handout right here, which is called Preparing Images. And that is what this looks like here. This is from the University of Michigan Library of Instructional Technology. It's a really good PDF that goes into a variety of different file formats. Now, again, like I said, this handout talks about preparing files not just for web, but also for print. So this is really good, useful information. It's a 10-page document. It's kind of what you would call a pocket guide. And it gets into not just how to prepare your images, but it also talks about what exactly is resolution, how does resolution affect memory size, and a variety of other useful bits of information. It even talks about preparing things for PowerPoint, which is another area of publication. So you can read through this, get to know what this is. We'll talk more about this later, but I expect you to be familiar with this information. And while you're not going to become an expert on it, at this point you should definitely be familiar with what's inside here and just have a rough idea of how this works. And we'll talk about how all this fits into a workflow a little later on. Now, the other link here is optimizing images for web. And again, this focuses specifically on getting things ready for website consumption. And that is this website right here, Optimizing Images for Web, a practical guide. And this focuses on a plugin that used to be an independent piece of software for Adobe called Adobe ImageReady. Years ago, in previous versions of the Adobe software, they had a freestanding piece of software called Adobe Image Ready, which allowed you to, as the name implies, get your images ready to be turned into web consumables. Now, there are various file types, of course, that are appropriate for web consumption, and that includes JPEGs. Now, there are two different types of JPEGs. There are web-specific JPEGs, and there are print-ready JPEGs. So you can see here it does talk about JPEGs. There are PNGs. PNGs work well with photography or gradient-based imagery, but PNGs also support transparency, meaning if you have a cutout or an area of your image that doesn't have any visuals in it and it's just air, you can see through it. PNGs can handle that. JPEGs do not handle transparency. They just handle basically photography or gradient-based images, pixel-based images. GIFs. Now, you might be familiar with GIFs as sort of those animated GIFs, images that move like little animations or, dancing snowmen or something like that. But GIFs are also a legitimate file type in terms of image preparation, and there are 8-bit GIFs, there are 24-bit GIFs, and they only handle 256 colors. They are very restricted in their colors, so they are therefore not good for photography, because a good photograph or gradient-based images has way more than 256 colors in it. So GIFs are great for sort of flat images that use minimal amounts of color. So anyway, this website goes through all of these different file types and how to prepare them properly using the Adobe Image Ready plugin. Now, like I said, Image Ready used to be a freestanding piece of software, but in recent years, Adobe has incorporated it as a plugin directly into both Photoshop and Illustrator, so you can access it through either piece of software. And this article goes through how to do that. So it's pretty great. It's real easy to do. We'll talk more about it a little later in the week, but you need to read this in advance and maybe do a little practicing with it in Photoshop and Illustrator before we go over it again, okay? So just get familiar with these ways in which you can prepare files for production, specifically for the web. Later on, we're also going to talk about things like cropping and preparing image size, because that's also important in getting things ready for production. So we'll talk about that a little later as well. All right, so go get studying that stuff. Keep working on your typographic poster. Don't forget to take quiz number 4, and I will see you later.